This week there's been a lot of talk about whether or not you're a racist if you voted for Mr. Trump. In the day since the election, I've seen myriad posts from my conservative friends and family sort of railing against this theory that a vote for Donald Trump is tantamount to a confession of unadulterated racism. For my conservative friends, I would just like to say I have some thoughts about that, and I want to share them with you. And I also want to reach out to some of my progressive brothers and sisters. So for my progressive friends, I want to say that I think the assumption that someone is a racist based strictly on their vote is just simply a rash generalization. And we all know that rash generalizations are the same thing that motivates racism. So again, I want to say that I think if you voted for Donald Trump, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a racist. Maybe you are. And maybe you don't have a problem with being called a racist. I don't think I know very many of those people. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you voted for Trump, you're a racist or a homophobe or a sexist. But it does, however, mean that you voted for a racist for the highest office in the land. Now, before you turn this off, let me finish. I understand that you are pissed, that you are upset at the system, that you are angry at what the world has given you, that you hate Hillary Clinton, that you think she's a crook or a criminal. I don't want to get into that. I want to get into the fact that you voted for Donald Trump, and I think there's pretty clear evidence that the man is a racist and a bigot, and if you voted for him, you voted for a racist and a bigot. I don't want to be overweight, but if you're friends with me, you're friends with an overweight man who is too loud and spends way too much money on records. I don't want those things to be true, but they are. It doesn't mean that you're overweight because you know me. So if you're a Trump voter, please, before you turn this off, I implore you to closely listen to what I have to say. The fear and the anger and the sadness that you see for progressives in your life is not because their candidate lost. It's not even really about politics right now. It's about what we see as a regression of our ideals and decency as a nation. So please give me just a few minutes to explain. Let me at least put into words what we're feeling, because if you really care about this country, half of us are terrified right now. Literally, half of the country is terrified right now at what we're going through and what we're thinking. So I want to objectively, as I can, give you some examples of why I'm concerned about this and what I think it means. And once we go through all of those examples, you can sort of parse those out with your head and your heart, and you can agree or disagree. But remember, even though I am bringing up these racist tendencies in your candidate's policies and behavior throughout his entire life, I'm not calling you a racist. But I want you to understand where we're coming from. So first of all, both Mr. Trump and his father have been accused on numerous occasions over decades for discriminatory renting practices in New York City. They routinely didn't rent to minorities, especially African Americans, or severely jacked up their rents in an effort to either push them out or to exploit them. In fact, literally dozens of these kinds of suits have been settled by the Trump family over the course of decades. And I have to assume that these were done mostly in an effort to avoid the embarrassment of a public trial. Now, when you refuse to rent to people simply based on the color of their skin, or you exploit them or overcharge them again because of the color of their skin, I hate to break it to you, this is what racism looks like. Example number 2. In May of 1989, Donald Trump placed a full-page ad in the New York Daily News. And in that ad, he called for the death penalty of 5 young men of color who were accused, and accused is the most important word here, accused of raping and beating a female jogger in Central Park. Those young men, after years of prison time, have all been exonerated and cleared. And yet, as recently as a month ago, Mr. Trump sort of doubled down on those beliefs that they were guilty and still insisted that they were guilty. And most of the reason that he's making this assumption is because of their color, not because of fact. These young men were mistreated and treated in an unconstitutional way by the New York City Police Department. And that was the case because of their age, the color of their skin, and their lack of intelligence. And in many cases, these young men's lives were ruined. Mr. Trump has continued to disavow their innocence simply on the color of their skin. I hate to break it to you, but this is what racism looks like. Now, throughout this campaign process, Mr. Trump has also called for a ban on Muslims entering this country. He has also more recently suggested that we should have a registry of every Muslim already living in this nation. So you would be forced to register for a list based strictly on your religious conviction. And recently, after the election, I believe on Wednesday, a New York Times reporter asked Mr. Trump about this policy and simply posed the question, what is the difference between a registry for Muslims in 21st century America and asking Jews to register in Nazi Germany in the 1930s? Stop. I'm not calling you a Nazi. This is really important. At no point have I ever said Donald Trump is a Nazi or you're a Nazi for voting for him. Please do not jump to that conclusion. Listen carefully to what I say. When that question was posed, what's the difference between Jews registering in Nazi Germany and Muslims registering here? Donald Trump repeatedly said, quote, I don't know, you tell me. This means two things. Number one, he refused to come up with a distinction between the two lists. And quite frankly, I can't think of one either, and I've been ruminating over it for a couple of days. Second thing is, he didn't immediately say, I would never endorse a policy that seemed like it would have been employed by Adolf Hitler. Now, you can say that that's not fair, but guess what? Life ain't fair. The man made a policy decision that he may or may not want to implement that is reminiscent of Hitler's genocide. I'm not saying he's going to put Muslims into camps. I'm not saying he's going to kill them. But the fact that he wants to put them on a list is un-American and unconstitutional. And if you voted for him, you voted for that. You supported that. And I hate to break it to you, but this is what racism looks like. Now, the KKK, also known as the Grand Wizard Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, or whatever hell goofy-ass term they've come up with themselves this week, and their illustrious former master, David Duke, have endorsed not only Trump's candidacy, but of course been thrilled at his election on Tuesday. Does this mean that Trump is working with the KKK? Of course not. I don't believe that. However, I'd like you to think about it like this. Imagine if you were a really frustrated parent, and one day your child was acting in the most awful, obnoxious, terrifying, horrible way, and you were in the grocery store. You're on 2 hours of sleep, you got a million things to do, you're frustrated, you're depressed, you're angry, you're having a bad day, you're exhausted, and just out of nowhere you snap and you hit your kid. And you feel just terrible. You are overcome with shame and regret. And while you're in the middle of that shame and regret, a man comes over to you, he shakes your hand and tells you, you are a good parent. You're a good parent for hitting your kid. He says, I beat my kids mercilessly all the time. I hit my wife. It means I'm in charge. And you look down to his side and you see that there's a little girl who's 4 or 5 years old and she is all beat up and she's got her head to the ground. Now, because this man endorsed your behavior in a moment of just rash mistake, because this man endorsed your behavior, does that make you a wife beater? No. Does that make you a child beater? No. But it does mean that you were endorsed by a man who does beat his children and who does beat his wife. And you now have a choice. You can either take his endorsement and you can reject it, and you can say, I'm going to live my life in a way that is in direct opposition to that man's philosophy, or I can simply do nothing. And if I do nothing, and that man goes out and beats his kids again, there is a tiny little part of you that is complicit in that. Now, I don't think that Donald Trump is a member of the KKK. I don't even know that he went out and actively sought their endorsement. But you have to remember that that man who beats his children and beats his wife and endorsed your moment of rash behavior, he's a horrible human being. The people in the KKK, they're horrible human beings. And don't sit there and think, well, maybe they are. They're horrible human beings. They've proven it. So Trump disavowed the Klan's endorsement eventually, but he's done nothing to change his behavior or his policy with anything other than words. He hasn't really distanced himself at all except to say, no, I don't really want their endorsement. And yet here they are, still celebrating his victory. He's not a Klansman for getting their endorsement, but he's not working away from them either. When you allow that sort of behavior to happen and you let people feel emboldened by your candidacy, that too is what racism looks like. Now, Mr. Trump has also promised to build a wall to keep out the Mexicans. He's promised to also deport the 11 million souls who are in this country illegally. And in doing so, he has generalized them. He has simply just said they're rapists, they're criminals, they're murderers, they're thugs. Now, regardless of what your thoughts might be on immigration policy, stereotyping an entire nation of people with a series of epithets and unfounded accusations is practically the walking definition of racism. He might as well paint a giant Cholo mural on the side of his border wall and hand out tacos as he sends them all back. Just tell the beaners to stay where they belong. Because this that we're talking about right now is what racism looks like. And of course, Mr. Trump's sexual predation is very well documented. And most of America seems to have just swept it under the rug. Now, let's not forget that Billy Bush was fired for just laughing at the things that Donald Trump said on that bus in that Access Hollywood tape. Billy Bush got fired from a terrible TV show. Donald Trump got elected president, and he's the one who said that stuff. I think this is a classic example of where we have just gotten it all wrong. If it's terrible enough for Billy Bush to get fired, and no one really stood up and said Mr. Bush shouldn't have been fired, should we have turned around and elected Mr. Trump to the highest office in our land? And since that tape came out, a dozen women have come forward and basically said, Mr. Trump did to me what we saw on that tape. And you can say these things aren't true. You can try to believe these things aren't true. But if you add in his routine mistreatment of women, the way he has referred to them as cows and fat pigs, the way he has referred to Secretary Clinton as a nasty woman in a debate because she simply said something he didn't like, you begin to see a disturbing pattern. And then you add in the fact that he's treated Alicia Machado and Rosie O'Donnell the way that he has, it just adds to that disturbing pattern. And perhaps most disturbing to me is the way that you hear him interviewed on Howard Stern, talking about how he went into a dressing room in a beauty pageant that he owned. And several women have corroborated this. Just to be around young naked women who could do nothing about it because he was in a position of power. And he sauntered around like a leech, like a creeper. This is what sexism and sexual predation look like. I know you don't want to admit this, but it's true. Now, I know you've heard all this before, but I want you to think about it from the perspective of those of us who don't just disagree with the man on policy, but are actually frightened by his air of entitlement and xenophobia, his sexism, and his racist tendencies. These examples that I have shown you, they're kind of the tip of the iceberg. They're sort of the big highlights, but they're certainly not the only patterns of racism, misogyny, and xenophobia in his life and in his policies. So I ask you, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, can you not find it in your heart to find out and understand why the progressives in your life are scared right now? Why we feel sad and depressed? It's not because we lost. I, for one, do not automatically assume that you're a racist because you voted for Mr. Trump. But if you can still support a man despite all of the above examples, aren't you a little complicit in emboldening his spirit? Edmund Burke once said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil to occur is for good men to do nothing. If you voted for Mr. Trump, you went a bridge beyond doing nothing. You supported the candidacy of a man who has an avowed history of racist and bigoted tendencies, who has shown complicit's the wrong word, who has shown an acceptance of an endorsement from people you and I find hopefully repugnant. He has gone out of his way to be xenophobic, to denigrate immigrant families, to basically have a bigoted approach to an entire religion based on nothing more than his own fear. And you, when you voted for him, you gave those philosophies, those racist tendencies, you gave them power, you gave them voice, you gave them strength, you gave them validation. And if you, my conservative friend, are still watching this, and you truly bristle at the idea of being associated with a racist, you must act against racism itself in any form that you see it. And this does not mean posting pedantic memes on social media. It doesn't mean posting a thing that says there's only one race, the human race, and then going out and doing nothing when you see racism and sexism occurring. If you do nothing, you side with the oppressor. If you do something, then you're fighting against it. You can vote for Mr. Trump and still fight against racism. I want to believe that that's true. But you cannot vote for Mr. Trump and do nothing and not have somebody call you a racist with a straight face. You just can't. And if you truly want to live in a place where we understand and care for each other, and I want to live in that place, and I want to believe that you want to live in that place, if you truly believe that, you have to understand that for a lot of us, the hope of that place just disappeared on Tuesday. Not because we lost an election. Not because we elected a man who doesn't have any policy experience. Not because we elected a man who has a vengeful streak. But because we feel like we witnessed the regression of American ideals on Tuesday. We saw years and decades of progress wash away like grains of sand back into the ocean. And I'm asking you, as my conservative friend, to refill me with that hope. Show me your love and your compassion, your decency and your acceptance of those who are different from you. Buck your fear and follow your kindness. It is your responsibility as much as it is mine. But I warn you, if you do not do these things, and I don't mean say these things, I don't mean repeat these things, I mean do these things to fight against racism and sexism and bigotry wherever you see it. If you don't do those things, you are the racist that you have been accused of. I will say that again. If you vote for Mr. Trump and you do nothing, when you see racism, and when racism is brought into your public policy, if you don't fight against that in an active way, you might as well be the racist you have been accused of being. I want to thank you very much for listening, and have a nice day.